When you're the best in the world, greatness isn't just expected, it's something one demands of themselves. But only the true greats can deliver on that promise each and every time out. Consistency. Well over 29 fights into his legendary career, no one has quite delivered like Jon Bones Jones, the youngest champion in UFC history, and a 19-fight unbeaten streak, spanning over a decade, longest in UFC history. 15 title fight wins, also the most in UFC history. Jon Jones has had one of the most interesting career paths of any athlete in sports, and is considered by many as the most talented fighter to ever step into the octagon. With his unorthodox striking, dominant wrestling, and the ability to finish the fight wherever it goes, Jon Jones, from the time of this recording, is still undefeated. And it's the other aspects of his game that has made it almost impossible for anyone walking this planet to beat him. By the end of this video, you will find out how Jon Bones Jones became the GOAT. Jon Jones has become the hardest fighter to beat, not only because of his talent, but he also comes from a family that has freak genetics that naturally gives Jon Jones an advantage physically against every single opponent he has faced. His oldest brother, Arthur Jones, is a Super Bowl champion, and his youngest brother, Chandler Jones, who is also a Super Bowl champion, is an NFL defensive end who is taller and has longer arms than Johnny Bones Jones. So with being 6'4" and having an absurd 84.5-inch reach, he was born with the perfect body for sports. You mix that with one of the best chins of all time, his fight IQ, and the ability to keep the fight wherever he wants it to be. It's no surprise that Jon Bones Jones is yet to taste defeat inside of the octagon. For a while, before Jon Jones made one of the greatest comebacks to MMA against Cyril Gane, which we will get to later in the video, it was widely agreed that Jones's career was starting to decline when he started finding himself spending more time partying and doing cocaine instead of continuing to build the legacy of being the greatest of all time. Lack of discipline for the better part of Jon Jones's UFC run after 2014 has cost him millions of dollars in endorsement deals, and has forever ruined his reputation in the eyes of many. Anytime a discussion about who are the greatest MMA fighters, it's impossible to avoid someone bringing up the fact that Jon Jones has failed multiple drug tests. But now, with USADA out of the picture, and Jon Bones Jones making it known that he has never taken steroids or any PEDs in his life, it is up to you to come to a conclusion if Jon Jones ever took anything to get an advantage over his opponents. Now, I don't know for a fact that Jon Jones took steroids. USADA was very inconsistent with how they treated Jon Jones compared to others when it came to failed drug tests. As soon as Jon Jones heard the announcement that USADA would be parting ways with the UFC, he went on to Twitter to tweet, "Man, I survived USADA. First they said I was guilty of having picograms. Now they consider me innocent. Next, picograms became legal. Guess what? I'm still here, still unbeaten. That BS no contest over Daniel Cormier needs to be taken off my record. I've never cheated the sport, and I will stand by that until the day I die." Goat emoji. so it's difficult for me to determine if he took steroids or not. But with the overwhelming evidence that he most likely has, it's tough to ignore. I mean, Chael Sonnen said he had more juice than Tropicana and still got pushed around by Jon Jones at UFC 159. And Jon Jones' own brothers have popped for PEDs in the NFL. Most importantly, Jon Jones competed in the UFC pre-USADA era, when a majority of fighters were on the juice. Some people even thought George St. Pierre was on steroids for a while. So, I'm not sure. I like to think that Jon Jones is innocent, but let me know in the comments. Now, I want to move past all Jon Jones' controversy and steroid allegations for the rest of this video. I just wanted to clear it up at the beginning of the video because I knew I would get some comments, people mentioning Jon Jones is a cheater, Jon Jones takes steroids. I'm gonna just focus on his actual performances inside of the octagon and explain why he is the greatest of all time, despite any steroid allegations, because only Jon Jones truly knows if he took steroids or not. Jones had a background in wrestling, where he would wrestle all the way through Endicott High School, even getting pinned by Matt Riddle of all people. I wonder what happened to him, by the way. Jones went on to become a state champion and went to ironically study criminal justice in college, where he would find himself sharing a room with Kobe Covington. But with the unexpected pregnancy of his now fiancée, he would drop out in need of quick money. Jon Jones would pursue an MMA career, which saw him go 6-0 over a period of 3 months, finishing all of his opponents. Jon Jones was still a raw prospect, but by the age of 21, he was signed to the UFC. In the beginning of Jones' UFC career, he slowly made a name for himself with an impressive victory against Andre Guzmão, and would go on to rack up a 3-fight win streak, with wins over the late Stephan Bonner and Jake O'Brien at UFC 100, the biggest card up until that point. His win streak was rudely interrupted, where till this day, the only official loss that sits on Jon Jones' record is a DQ loss at the Ultimate Fighter 10 finale, due to Jones beating his opponent's ass so bad that ref Steve Mazzagatti, one of the worst referees in UFC history, stepped in to call the fight after Jones threw some 12-6 elbows that had Matt Hamill badly hurt. But the thing that makes no sense is that the fight wasn't even stopped because of the elbows. It's because Steve Mazzagatti, possibly the worst ref in UFC history, right behind Mario Yamasaki, asked Matt Hamill, who is deaf by the way, if he could continue.
Does anybody here disagree with me that Mazzagatti is a fucking toolbox?
Yeah.
So yeah, that is why Jones has that one loss on his record. But everyone knows Jon Jones is still unbeaten and that loss doesn't count. By this point in the UFC, Chuck the Iceman Liddell, who was the face of the sport, ruled the light heavyweight division for many years, but was on the decline of his career after being brutally KO'd in consecutive fights, starting with the Rampage Jackson loss. And during Jon Jones' run up to his title fight, the light heavyweight division title was being tossed up like a hot potato. First officially starting when Rashad Evans knocked out Forrest Griffin, then he got knocked out in his first title defense. Then so did Lyoto Machida after just one title defense against Shogun Rua, where Shogun went on to get his revenge and would become the first man to solve the Machida puzzle, thus having his first title defense scheduled against Rashad Evans, who earned his way back to the title shot, but would be sidelined after getting an injury preparing for Shogun Rua. Jones would go on to rack up 3 more wins over tough competition, and was granted in his post-fight interview after submitting Ryan Bader at UFC 126 a title shot, replacing his training partner Rashad Evans. At first, Rashad Evans was in support over Jones getting his opportunity, regardless of the fact that they competed in the same division. Rashad Evans expressed he had no interest in fighting his training partner and would go on to move down to middleweight if Jones was successful in capturing the belt. However, friction grew between Rashad Evans and the Greg Jackson's gym, as Rashad felt betrayed and said that if Jon Jones became the champion in the light heavyweight division, that he would leave the camp. At this point, Rashad Evans and Jon Jones had a close relationship, but Rashad Evans believed Greg Jackson turned his back on his original fighters in favor of new talent, planting the seeds for Jon Jones' first real rival. But before he faced Rashad Evans, Jon Jones went on to face Shogun Rua at UFC 128 and shocked the world by completely dominating one of the best 205ers on the planet at that point with ease, becoming the youngest world champion in UFC history at just 23 years of age. Jones' first title defense would come in the way of Rampage Jackson, and in this fight, Jon Jones completely shut down Rampage Jackson's stand-up, and then would eventually go on to finish him with a rear naked choke. His next victim would be Lyoto Machida. In the fight, Lyoto Machida had Jon Jones in trouble in the first round, but Jon Jones quickly adapted to Machida's attacks and rocked the Dragon on the feet, then proceeded to choke Lyoto Machida completely unconscious. And in just 1 year, Jon Jones completely dominated and destroyed 3 former UFC light heavyweight champions consecutively. At UFC 145, Jon Jones faced his rival Rashad Evans and completely dominated him from round 1 to round 5 by out-wrestling him, stunning him with nasty elbows, and picking up an important win early in his title run. At UFC 152, Jon Jones faced TRT Vitor Belfort, who came the closest to defeating Jon Jones when he had Jon Jones' arm hyperextended, where Jones let his arm pop out of position just to escape the submission attempt, and then went on to submit Vitor Belfort with an Americana submission. People forget that at this point, Vitor Belfort was one of the scariest fighters, since his TRT exemption allowed him to return to prime form whilst having the experience of a veteran fighter. But it just wasn't enough to defeat Johnny Bones Jones. At UFC 159, Chael Sonnen, through the power of trash talk, convinced the UFC to give him a title shot against Jon Jones. And let's just say that Jon Jones made easy work of the undefeated, undisputed Chael Sonnen. By the time we entered 2013, Jon Jones had already 5 title defenses, with 4 of the opponents being former UFC champions, in just 2 years of holding the belt. It looked like there was going to be no one that could give him a challenge at 205. However, at UFC 165, Jones was scheduled to face what was supposed to be his toughest challenge yet. The first time Jones would have to fight a man his size, length, and height apart from his reach. Alexander Gustafsson was said to have the formula to finally give Jones some trouble. At 6'5", with better boxing and footwork than Jon Jones, and underrated grappling, Gustafsson believed that he was the one who was going to put a stop to Jon Jones' title reign. However, Jon Jones didn't take this fight serious at all, as he only trained a couple of weeks before the fight and was busy getting drunk a week before the fight, as he mentioned on Joe Rogan's podcast. At UFC 165, we witnessed one of the best UFC title fights of all time, which shouldn't have been the case. But Jon Jones found a way to get it done by decision, despite many believing Jones lost the fight. But the most important thing we learned from Jon Jones that night is that he never quits in a fight and will always find a way to win, no matter how the fight is going. Alexander Gustafsson gave Jon Jones his hardest fight up until that point. In my opinion, Jon Jones' performance against Glover Teixeira at UFC 172 back in 2014 is his most impressive performance of his career. Simply because he fought Glover at a range where Glover had the best chance of winning, which was inside of the pocket, and Jones did this intentionally and won every single exchange and did whatever he wanted to the former UFC light heavyweight champion Glover Teixeira when Glover was in his prime. Jones threw axe kicks. He tried to rip off Teixeira's arm at one point in the fight and could have easily finished him. But Jones was at a point where he didn't have anything to prove and was pretty much just playing with his food. His next performance against Daniel Cormier at UFC 182 back in 2015 was equally as impressive. He was the first person to ever take down DC, an Olympian, and won every single round without feeling threatened for 1 second. At this point of Daniel Cormier's career, he was undefeated, and he just came off dominating Dan Henderson and choking him completely unconscious. So people thought that DC posed a lot of threats to Jones's title reign and could give him a challenge, but Jon Jones completely dominated him from round 1 to round 5 and left DC crying on Cain Velasquez's shoulders after the fight. He did lose his huge Nike and Gatorade deal after a brawl with DC before the fight, but Reebok signed him just in time for the fight. Some people forget that Nike wanted to become part of one of the fastest growing sports, which was a huge deal at the time, as the UFC was still striving to be taken seriously as a mainstream sport, alongside the NFL and the NBA. And Jon Jones having two major brand deals with Gatorade and Nike was a very big deal at the time. And he was also the first MMA fighter to sign a global endorsement deal with Nike, which meant he was the LeBron James of MMA. Now let that sink in. Another thing to note is that before Jones started getting in legal trouble, he was the most marketable fighter on the UFC roster, as he carried himself more as an athlete than a fighter or mixed martial artist. If Jones still had those deals and would have stayed out of trouble, I can only wonder how much more of a draw he would have been. But as we found out in his return, his popularity wasn't affected. Jon Jones is more popular now than ever. Jones was also featured on the cover of EA Sports UFC, but was later dropped from the promotion of the game after several run-ins with the law. On April 2015, Jon Jones was involved in a hit and run and was stripped of his light heavyweight UFC title, and the UFC removed him from the official fighter rankings. On April 23rd, 2016, Jon Jones returned to competition after a 15-month absence, and he defeated Ovince St. Preux by unanimous decision, and would go on to capture the interim light heavyweight UFC belt, which he tossed on the ground and said that he wanted the real belt, and the real belt at the time was around the waist of Daniel Cormier. Jon Jones was scheduled to face Daniel Cormier to unify the light heavyweight belt at UFC 200, but failed a drug test, and his rematch against Daniel Cormier was scrapped off the UFC 200 card after being flagged by the US Anti-Doping Agency for a potential doping violation. On November the 7th, 2016, Jon Jones was issued a 1-year ban from USADA for his failed drug test, and the hearing had revealed that Jon Jones was using PEDs, which he blamed on dick pills. But USADA didn't care, and he still got suspended anyway. And on November the 9th, 2016, Jones got stripped of his interim title by the UFC and was the first champion to be stripped twice. So the whole of 2016 was the lowest in Jon Jones' career and personal life. On July the 29th, 2017, after another 15-month suspension, Jones finally made his comeback against Daniel Cormier, where Jones would score a brutal third-round knockout after connecting with a devastating head kick to retain his light heavyweight championship that he never lost. And this was a big moment for Jon Jones. At this point, everyone believed Jon Jones was back. Jon Jones was not only the first person to beat Daniel Cormier, but he finished Daniel Cormier in a rematch, which was a huge statement. But unfortunately, after the fight on August the 22nd, 2017, Jon Jones was notified of a potential violation of the UFC's anti-doping policy stemming from a drug screening on July the 28th, one day before the UFC 214 rematch with Cormier, and the anabolic steroid Turinabol was found in his system in a test administered by USADA, resulting in the fight being ruled a no contest. Daniel Cormier was reinstated as champion on October the 10th, 2018. The UFC booked Jones to return to the octagon on December the 29th to have a rematch with Alexander Gustafsson, who many people thought beat Jones in their first fight, for the UFC light heavyweight belt after Daniel Cormier's move to heavyweight and him relinquishing the UFC light heavyweight belt. Jon Jones was drug tested on the day of weigh-ins, and the trace amount of Turinabol, the same metabolite that earned him his ban, was found again in his system. But USADA said that they couldn't really punish him for the same violation and let it slide. Regardless of the pre-fight controversy, Jones proved that with a real training camp where he actually took Gustafsson serious, that Gustafsson was not on his level. In 2019, Jon Jones had his most active year since 2013. At UFC 235, Jon Jones faced Anthony Smith, where Jon Jones picked up a unanimous decision win. This began the 3-fight streak where Jones was active but fighting contenders that didn't excite him, resulting in disappointing performances where people thought Jones wasn't improving. But as we found out in his return, it was simply a lack of motivation that resulted in fights where Jones should have finished his opponents, just like he did the previous fight with Gustafsson, where he was actually excited to fight his opponent to silence the doubters. At UFC 239, Jon Jones faced Thiago Santos and beat him in a split decision in a very close fight. And in the fight, Thiago Santos blew out everything in both his knees, and Jones still struggled. It was getting to the point where it felt like Jon Jones was not as aggressive as he used to be, and just not as dangerous as he used to be. Everyone knew that the way Jones was approaching these fights, he would soon face an up-and-coming, hungry challenger that would want him more than him. Then arrives Dominick Reyes, who was Jones's next scheduled fight, before Reyes' UFC career completely fell off a cliff. He built up the persona of being the new generation of fighter. He brutally knocked out Chris Weidman that earned him a chance at the GOAT. For the first time, Jones would face a real athlete just like himself. Dominick Reyes was a 6'4" former collegiate football player who failed to make the NFL but turned that failure into a successful MMA career. Before running into Jones, he was undefeated and had the longest active win streak in the light heavyweight division with a 75% finish rate. He was definitely a dangerous opponent for Jon Jones. But it still didn't excite Jones since Dominic Reyes didn't have that big of a name and Jones had more to lose than to gain by fighting Dominic Reyes. Jones would pick up a very controversial split decision win in a fight many people believed Dominic Reyes won. It was clear that Jones at this point was bored of the light heavyweight division. He needed something that would make him want to compete at the highest level and not fight to the level of his lesser opponents. On February the 8th, 2020, Jon Jones officially announced that he is moving to the heavyweight division and took 3 years off to start his bulk. He was initially targeting Francis Ngannou, who was the UFC heavyweight champion at the time, but unfortunately the fight never took place. I just want to mention that a lot of controversy happened to Jones between those 3 years, but honestly, for this video, I really wanted to focus more on Jones inside of the octagon, rather than his issues outside of the octagon. Since in every single Jon Jones documentary, it has been discussed countless of times, and most people already know what has taken place by now. It seems that now Jon Jones is in a good place, as long as he stays away from Las Vegas. It is the year 2023. The UFC heavyweight belt is left for the taking as Francis Ngannou and the UFC part ways. And the UFC decide to have Jon Jones make his official UFC debut for the belt against the #1 contender Ciryl Gane, the best striker in the heavyweight division, a French sniper with elite athleticism and the best footwork of any heavyweight we've ever seen. Jon Jones, to truly call himself the baddest man on the planet, he had to prove it by making the move to heavyweight. Before the fight, Jones not only said he would dominate Ciryl Gane, but that he would make the fight look surprisingly easy. It was time to find out if the greatest UFC light heavyweight with an unbeaten 18-fight win streak could move up bigger and better to conquer a new division, this time to cement himself as the best heavyweight on the planet. At UFC 285, Jones not only came through with his promise to make the fight look easy with a first-round submission win, but he made Ciryl Gane, one of the best UFC heavyweights, look like a stepping stone to the final fight that I believe will put the cherry on top of the messy yet illustrious career of the greatest fighter of all time, Jon Bones Jones. It took 3 years, but Jones is finally back to being the pound-for-pound king. He just has one more challenge ahead of him before he can call it a career. That man is the most decorated UFC heavyweight of all time, Stipe Miocic. If Jones can get through him, which I believe he will in vintage Jon Jones fashion, there can be no debate who the baddest man on the planet is.